Okay, so we will go ahead and start. Again, welcome everybody. My name is Collin Paschall. I am the program director for the Data Analytics and Policy program at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm very pleased to be joined tonight with my co-author, Dr. Benjamin Kantack of Lycoming College, as well as my colleague at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Sang-Hoon Kim Leffingwell, who is the program coordinator for the Data Analytics and Policy program. So thank you to both Ben and Sang-Hoon for being here tonight. And thank you for those of you in the audience for joining us for the faculty spotlight, the spotlight being on me and Dr. Kantack this evening. We are going to be presenting a piece of scholarship that we co-authored and came out, I think it was actually published earlier this year, but it's, as these things go, has been in the process for quite a while. It's a journal article that was published in Public Understanding of Science, and the title is Perceptions of Policy Problems and Solutions, Climate Change and Structural Racism. And it's a short survey experiment that Dr. Kantack and I did that explores some of the relationship between the perceptions of policy problems and solutions among citizens with respect to these two important and interesting issues. So very pleased to present this work tonight. We're going to have Dr. Kantack kick us off with the first part of our talk, about the motivation and some of the background for our research. And then I will pick it up, talk a bit about the data and the methods that we used. And then after that, we will turn it over to Dr. Kim Leffingwell, who will provide a few additional comments and questions for us. And then after that, if there's any questions from the audience, we'll be happy to take those and engage in a little bit of a deeper discussion if there's interest and if there's questions that pop up. So with that, thanks all again very much for joining, and take it away, Dr. Kantack. And I will do my best to follow with the slides. So Ben, if you need me to advance anything, just let me know.
Right. Yeah, you're the captain on the button there. So thank you, Dr. Paschall, for that introduction. Thank you, Dr. Kim Leffingwell, for being our moderator. Thank you to all of you for in the peanut gallery there watching us tonight. Looking forward to your questions, suggestions, and ideas. So the motivation for this project is trying to look for some of the connections between these two issues, which, although they seem very different in terms of the kinds of problems that are discussed with them, or that are, the solutions that are involved, we found there were some interesting similarities, at least on the surface, when we sort of understood kind of how these are talked about and argued in the public sphere. So in both cases, climate change and structural racism, it's a case where it's a partisan divide. Democrats tend to be more on the side of sort of supporting certain proposed solutions to these problems. Republicans tend to be on the side of opposing those solutions. So the back and forth breaks on that partisan line. When that argument happens, Democrats are often sort of accusing Republicans of denying science or denying reality. So if you've probably heard the term climate change denier, or climate change denial being used in the news, and people saying, I think Hillary Clinton said, "I believe in science" at one of the Democratic National Conventions, sort of making that stance. This is a real thing. You're ignoring or denying this problem. And a similar thing comes up with structural racism, sort of claiming that, well, this is this is a problem that you're ignoring, you're blind to it, you're sort of not recognizing these inequalities, and sort of pretending that everything is fine when it's actually not. Republicans on the other side of the debate often accuse Democrats of taking extreme policy lines or extreme policy proposals for solving these problems. So when something like the Green New Deal is proposed to combat climate change, or slavery reparations are proposed to combat structural racism, Republicans often take the line that this is too extreme. This is a radical, drastic policy that's going to have disastrous effects on the economy or on society or whatever else you might have. So there are some sort of parallels in terms of how these different issues are talked about. But it often comes down to, or it feels like it's being pitched as a fight between an activist wing that wants to make these big changes and a bunch of deniers who are completely head in the sand and don't acknowledge the problem exists. And we think that this misses an important dimension of both of these policy issues, which is that there are a lot of arguments made and people who sort of take the stance that these problems are real, they exist, but they don't necessarily support the solutions being offered for that. And you can, if you look at some of the arguments being made, about this, you can find this pattern emerging. So when Scott Pruitt, who was President Donald Trump's first EPA administrator, was doing his confirmation hearing for the Senate, he took very clearly the stance that the climate is changing, that human activity in some manner impacts that change. What to do about it is a matter for debate and dialogue. So not convinced on what we should do about it yet, but I'm not denying that it exists, right? The climate is changing, right? Taking that clear sort of stance. A little more blunt way of putting it comes from Ben Shapiro, conservative commentator on Twitter, saying the question isn't whether climate change is happening. It's whether you have any solutions that aren't crazy and you're screaming that it's happening or what is the solution. So not stating that this is nothing that exists, right? Not denying that climate is real, but sort of saying, I want to focus on the solutions, and that's where I have a problem here. This is in climate change, but you can find similar sort of sentiments expressed among elite opinion holders on the issue of structural racism. So Mona Charen, a conservative columnist, takes the stance and admits, of course, there was great suffering during slavery and afterward, in the years after, but reparations would not heal that pain, not heal that problem any more than punishing the progeny of dead slave owners would sort of rectify that. So saying, hey, this thing did happen, this was a real event, and it has its sort of legacy now, but I disagree with the solution. Similarly, author Lionel Shriver takes a similar stance on reparations here again, saying that these are inequalities that have deep, enduring social drivers. They're real. They're things that are durable. They are with us to this day. But reparations are crude. They're inefficient. They would create far more problems than they would solve. So in both cases, you have a situation where people are making statements that are at least not denying and possibly even acknowledging that these are real problems, these things exist, but then focusing on the solution, saying, I don't like this particular solution. It's ineffective, or it's too radical, or something along those lines. And of course, this could just be rhetorical. It could be that maybe they actually do deny the problems and are taking that stance because they don't want to be accused of being deniers. But it's possible that this actually reflects sort of an honest position on the issue, which is that I don't disagree with the facts of what's happening. I disagree with the normative claim, what we should do about it, the prescriptive claim about it. So that's kind of our motivation for reading into this. And what we want to know, our research question is broken down into a few parts here. First of all, are these arguments really representative of the public in general? Is there a segment of the population that does sort of take this position that this is a real problem? I don't mind acknowledging the problem, but I don't agree with the solutions that are being offered. So I oppose the solutions without denying the problem that exists. And then how much of that, true denial really is there versus those who just are kind of not sure about the policy. So is it really the case that the opposition to, say, the Green New Deal is a bunch of climate deniers? Or are there a lot of folks who kind of take the position this is a real thing, but I disagree with the policy? And so if it's the case that there is sort of a segment of the population that doesn't deny the problem, but does oppose a solution, would moderating proposals of certain policies make them more palatable to that particular audience? Think about it this way. If you're a climate change denier or a structural racism denier, it doesn't matter how extreme or moderate the policy is because it's solving a non-existent problem in your mind. But if you're somebody who acknowledges that this is an issue, this is a problem, but you're not so keen on a particularly extreme or radical solution in your eyes, you might be persuadable by a more moderate position, moderate policy, because you feel like it could actually address a problem that you acknowledge as being real. So that's kind of what we're taking as sort of our goal for this project. We know some things from the past. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I just jump in real quick, Ben, and add one thing to that, and you can tell me if I'm off base on this or not. But I think one of the things we were kind of shooting for with this project is investigating more deeply this sort of folk theory of persuasion that seems to be out there in the world, that if only you could convince the climate deniers or the racism deniers that the problem was real, then I think there's a bit of a shortcut on the side of many progressive advocates to say, if we could convince you the problem is real, then automatically you are going to believe in the large scale extreme solution that is required to address the problem. So in some sense, the issue of persuading about the problem and the solution has been sort of collapsed into one thing among some advocates, when I think that we're trying to sort of tease apart these two things and say, how different are these dimensions of problem belief versus solution belief, and trying to explore that a little more deeply. So that's just another way of thinking about the framing of the project, if that makes sense.
Right. And if you're somebody in the audience here who's sort of thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense to me, that you could oppose a problem that you acknowledge, right? Perhaps you're somebody who says, well, the fact that if these facts are true about the climate changing the way it is, that is evidence enough, that's proof enough that we have to act, right? Because it's often talked about as an existential crisis, right? Or if there is evidence of gaps in whether it's criminal justice or educational opportunity or economic opportunity in race that are systemic, that is enough reason to say we need to act, we need to have a radical solution to address it. So for a lot of people, especially Democrats and liberals, you don't need any more argumentation than just proving the problem exists to then say, well, I jumped to the solution, which can make it hard to sort of, understand the rationale behind somebody who opposes these solutions for ideological or practical or whatever other considerations. And so that we think that might be leading people to kind of ignore this group and thinking that, well, if only we could prove these issues are real, then everybody would be on board with our policies. Some people already believe these issues are real, but aren't on board with the policies yet. And so we're trying to kind of address or figure out what's going on there. So from the existing literature, from past research, we know several things that kind of bring to bear how we think about this issue. First of all, we know that people aren't exactly expert processors of political information. Citizens are biased in what they receive information and how they process it. And oftentimes people will support or will oppose policies which would be in their short or long-term interest for ideological reasons or partisan reasons or other reasons like identity, or just other reasons of not really understanding what the policies are at stake. So there's definitely room for somebody to, have reasons to sort of oppose a policy that might actually be beneficial for them in the long run, which could explain some of these gaps. We also know that these problems are abstract ones, and they're often harder to perceive than concrete problems. So it's easy to see, for example, images of crime, conjure images of crime happening, kind of recognize that as a problem. Climate change, although you can see hurricanes, you can see extreme weather, it's hard to perceive as an individual the gradual rise of the Earth's average temperatures. And likewise, if the racism in this case is systemic, if it's built into the system and occurs in subtle ways as opposed to like overt discrimination, that's really hard to perceive. You can look at figures and data, but it's hard to kind of conjure the images that would sort of show what that looks like. So it could be harder to sort of recognize these problems or understand them in the same way as you might understand unemployment or crime or terrorism as having sort of very concrete sort of images that get conjured up. And of course, the Democrats and Republicans.
I would just add one. Can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah.
I would just say with respect to racism, I want to be a little careful about that topic, because it is true that everyone's perception of racism, I think, is a bit different based on probably your own skin color and background. So particularly, I might suggest that for white people who don't recognize or probably don't experience racism in the same way as other communities might, it is a particularly difficult thing, I think, for some parts of the society to to see. So that might not be like a universal statement. There may be some like group specific dynamics going on there. I just want to acknowledge that
Sure.
your perception of some of these processes is probably contingent to some extent on your own identity. So didn't mean to throw you off, Ben. I just wanted to put in that quick caveat.
No, that's right. And the same thing is true for climate change, right? Like if you're somebody who is living in an area of Louisiana that is seeing sort of, rapid erosion of your shoreline and that kind of thing, then you're going to have a different contextual awareness of what this problem or different way of perceiving it than somebody who lives, 3 states inland and isn't really sort of perceiving big changes to their local climate kind of thing, right? So it's not the case that these problems would be equally hard or easy for anybody to perceive. It would depend on the context and your own experience too.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking on average here. So anyway, thank you.
Right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The last sort of lesson that we have from past research kind of informs what we're doing here is that Democrats and Republicans are going to live in different facial environments. They are exposed to different news, different opinions. The divergence of ideological and partisan biased media over the last couple of decades has sort of made it easier to create sort of informational partisan bubbles. And there are different patterns of thinking from political psychology that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives think about the world in different ways. They have, in some cases, very deep sort of psychological distinctions that could make one group more perceptive of certain threats than others, or more valuing of certain things over others. So it is the case that people could just think about some of these policies differently. And again, like we mentioned before, like my colleague brought up here, if you're somebody for whom the existence of global warming and climate change makes it obvious that you go right to a policy solution, an extreme one, somebody else might not make that connection with the same sort of immediacy or same sort of automaticity. So this is all kind of the background from past research, kind of gives us a reason to think there could be kind of a difference in perceiving these problem and solution connections here. So from all that, we kind of have 2 expectations going into this study that we wanted to try to demonstrate or to observe. The first is that we think that probably a lot of Americans are going to acknowledge that climate change and structural racism are real things. They'll admit that there is, systemic inequalities and that the climate is changing. But they'll also oppose drastic policy solutions to address those problems. So our first kind of thought is, does this group exist? Is it a substantial number? We think the answer is yes, but that was part of our purpose of this project, is kind of figure out, is that a real thing or not? And then if that group exists, we all expect that extreme policy proposals, like big drastic policy changes, are going to be less effective than moderate policy proposals at mustering support among the public. Remember, if everybody who's opposing them is a denier, then extreme and moderate shouldn't make much of a difference because it's a non-problem to me, so I shouldn't want any solution. But if I'm somebody who recognizes that a problem exists, I might be more supportive, more prone to want sort of approve a moderate policy proposal than an extreme one. That's kind of our going into this project expectations. And I think I'm going to turn it over at this point to Collin to kind of walk you through what we actually did with the study.
Yeah, perfect, Ben. Thank you for that setup, and thank you for letting me chime in there a couple of times with a few other things. And I'll feel free similarly if I'm going through the data and methods to chime in if you have any additions you'd like to make. So the setup for this, as with many sort of political psychology questions, a very common tool in this area is to use a survey. So we have a survey experiment, which is the basis for the empirics of this paper. And we did a survey experiment of 1,000 Amazon MTurk workers who were randomly assigned to climate change or structural racism conditions or to a control group. And so just for those of you who may not be familiar, Amazon MTurk is a service by which you can recruit human participants to do very simple tasks for you. And there are that require like human intelligence. And so there are like business applications for MTurk where you have like, I don't know, data entry problems, or you need to like quality control, a website or something like that, you can hire interkers to do small little tasks for you for a small amount of money, sometimes like $1 or a quarter even, depending on what you're asking them to do. But MTurk has also become a very popular platform for doing social science research like what we're doing, because it allows you to do, for relatively small amounts of money, simple survey experiments where you can ask people about their political attitudes. So we recruited 1,000 of these people, and we used random assignment again to put them into a climate change or structural racism groups. And then within these groups, the individuals were either within an extreme treatment condition or a moderate treatment condition, or within a control condition where they just weren't presented anything. And so what the individuals were receiving were these sort of extreme policy proposals that are in response to structural racism or climate change, or a more moderate policy proposal that was related to addressing the problem of structural racism and climate change. And we'll go in a minute. I'll read the entire prompts to you in just a minute, but that's the general setup. And for the extreme position, for those people who had to read an extreme policy proposal, in the group of survey respondents that we were asking about structural racism, they read a proposal about slavery reparations, which is widely considered to be an extreme approach to sort of equalizing or atoning for the history of racial discrimination in the United States towards African Americans. Reparations being like the government will write a check to African Americans. It's a way to sort of compensate them for the generations of discrimination and oppression that they've suffered from as a result of slavery in the U.S. And so that was for the group of citizens that we were using to investigate structural racism. For the climate change group, we read to them a policy proposal for a Green New Deal, which was like very expansive policy. And again, I'll show you the exact text in just a minute, but it was sort of we need to shift our entire economy quickly away from carbon as a way to address climate change. So that was our extreme policy proposal for that group. For structural racism, I'm sorry, for the moderate experimental condition, for the group about structural racism, we had a more sort of medium proposal related to affirmative action. And for the group where we were asking about climate change, we had a little sort of proposed a more balanced environmental regulation. And again, we'll show you the exact text here in just a minute. So again, the point here is that we have two groups of people, about 500 people per group, one group about structural racism, one group about climate change, and we're throwing these different policy proposals at these people randomly, and we're going to try to sort of test for the difference of reaction between the effects of these different kinds of proposals on their attitudes towards these topics.
And I should jump in briefly to say, if I might, that so we've used, and you can see here we've put extreme and moderate in quotes here. What we kind of want to emphasize here is that we're not taking a sort of a stance as to whether these policies are sort of the right or wrong policies here. We just mean that from the standpoint of doing nothing as kind of the status quo, affirmative action is a more moderate proposal than reparations for slavery. And a balanced environmental regulation policy is more moderate than a Green New Deal, which would be more extreme. If we were looking at issues where it was the Republicans who wanted to move things, then whichever would be the more right-leaning policy would be the more extreme one. So these are just in relative terms here. We're not sort of saying, well, this is too far outside the beyond the pale or whatever. So we use these for comparison here, but we're not trying to imply that only the moderate is the good one or the extreme is the bad, anything like that.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Ben. That's an important qualification. So again, we're throwing these different arguments at people, and the goal is to get an understanding of how being exposed to these different arguments affects their underlying attitudes, and to measure our respondents' attitudes towards climate change and structural racism. We use two different question batteries. For the structural racism, we used a very common scale, which is well validated by social scientists, which is called the symbolic racism battery, which is a way to measure attitudes towards racism, essentially. And so people that score on the extremes of this scale, if you score higher or lower, depending on if you invert the scale or not, you can either have, if you're high on this, you have more racist attitudes. If you have lower on this, you have like less racist attitudes. And along with that, we took that battery, which is very well validated, and we created our own climate change battery, which was modeled on it. So we took the questions that were about racial attitudes and we modified them to sort of capture attitudes about belief in the problem of climate change and also the enthusiasm for like solutions to address the problem of climate change. So that's sort of these two parallel scales intended to measure attitudes about these two topics. And the way we arranged it in the paper is that we set it up so that higher scores on both of these scales could be equated with more belief in the underlying problem and more enthusiasm for potential solutions. So I've said several times that I would show you the actual language you use. So let me go ahead and do that. So for the group that we were asking questions about structural racism, these were the two experimental conditions we used. For the extreme policy, we said, we just read this statement to them. We had the respondents read this statement. And for the extreme policy group, it was the federal government should make a formal apology to African Americans for the legacy of slavery in the United States and enact legislation that would financially compensate African Americans. Doing this will help address the losses African Americans continue to experience from systematic discrimination and prejudice. So basically just a straightforward, simple argument for slavery reparations, which again, many people would perceive as an extreme policy solution. Again, whether or not that's actually extreme or not depends on your own perspective, but many people would consider that a big departure from our current policy regime in the US. A more moderate policy that would address the problem of structural racism is something associated with like affirmative action. And so our proposal for this group of respondents was that the federal government should enact legislation to reduce racial inequality and discrimination in the United States and attempt to level the playing field by increasing opportunities for African Americans in education and the workplace. Making it easier for African Americans to get ahead will help address the legacy of prejudice. So this is a somewhat scaled back proposal, not as expansive as like slavery reparations. In some ways, it's almost like the policy status quo, at least prior to whatever the Supreme Court's getting ready to do about affirmative action later this year. So a policy that is designed to increase racial equity, but is not as dramatic as what slavery reparations would be. So similarly, again, for the climate change group, we gave two different experimental conditions. We had respondents read one of two different policy proposals. And for the extreme policy proposal for climate change, again, it was sort of a Green New Deal thing. We need a Green New Deal that reorganizes our economy around reducing our carbon footprints. We will need a higher tax on carbon, congestion pricing to drive in cities, and higher prices for airfare. We can use those funds to build public transit, pedestrian walkways, bike lanes, and other projects that will shift people away from carbon. This may cause some short-term economic pain, but it's a necessary sacrifice. So again, this is more or less what I think a Green New Deal advocate would say. Rapid decarbonization of the economy, sort of even if it causes economic pain, the pain will be worth it in the long run. A more moderate, the more moderate policy that we presented to respondents was that we need a policy that balances the need to reduce our carbon footprint against maintaining economic growth. We may need to apply some resources towards building public infrastructure that will shift people away from using as much carbon, like building public transit, pedestrian walkways, bike lanes, other projects. We have to balance the short-term economic costs of such actions against the possibility of climate-related problems in the future. So really just a somewhat, again, less dramatic, more scaled back, more reserved tone of the policy proposal here, in contrast to the more extreme, more expansive Green New Deal approach. So again, the respondents in the survey were split into these two groups, and then we randomly assigned which one of these policy proposals they had to read. And then after they read the policy proposal, we would measure their attitudes towards climate change and structural racism. And the goal is to sort of see what the difference is in their attitudes depending on which one of the experimental conditions they were exposed to. I should also mention that there is a control group who did not receive any policy proposal in there. They would just be sent straight to the questionnaire, and they would not be presented with any proposal at all. So we do have a control group that we can use when we do the statistical analysis and run the numbers here in a little bit. I'm not going to show you the entire batteries for the sake of time for the structural racism and climate change, but generally speaking, these scales are composed of questions that get at problems and solutions, because they sort of capture this idea of, do you believe in the underlying problem and how enthusiastic are you about the solution? So for example, these are two items from our scales. The one on the left is an item from the symbolic racism scale. The item on the right is an item from our climate change scale. And these are two questions that we kind of designed to be sort of equivalent in some way as we were sort of adapting one scale from the racism questions to the climate change context. So, for example, the item for symbolic racism is generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. The equivalent question that we designed for the climate change scale was decades of industrialization and pollution have created climate conditions that make it more difficult for future generations to be better off than we are today. So again, just sort of two parallel constructions that sort of get at the underlying problem associated with these two phenomena.
And these are agree, disagree items, so you could pick on a scale for how much you agree or disagree with them.
Yes, thanks, Ben. Thanks for clarifying that. And then just to give you another little taste of the sort of the flip side of that, the more solution-oriented questionnaire items on the left for symbolic racism, it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they would be just as well off as whites. That's the symbolic racism version. The climate change version is, it's just really a matter of natural cycles between warm periods and cold periods. If we would only leave the issue alone, climate change would take care of itself. So again, sort of two takes on the solution, one racism, one climate change. Okay, so moving on to our results. As you would expect, given that this paper got published, we actually do have some results that more or less aligned with our expectations. We did find that the extreme treatment tended to modestly lower structural racism attitudes. So what that means is that the participants that were exposed to the extreme proposal for slavery reparations tended to express in the subsequent questionnaire slightly lower, this is always a little backwards. They expressed less racially progressive attitudes as a result of being exposed to the extreme condition. So in a sense, they were sort of more racist. I want to be very careful with that language, but they were sort of more racist after receiving the extreme treatments. As sort of like a blowback or like a sort of a slingshot effect or something. People reacted strongly to the extreme proposal for reparations by being less racially progressive. And another result that we found was that the moderate treatment that we exposed people to modestly raised solution-related climate change attitudes among the subsequent further respondents. So if we gave you a moderate proposal for environmental protection, a moderate decarbonization plan, then especially Republicans among our respondents tended to be a little more optimistic, a little bit more open to some kind of solution rate related attitudes to climate change. So sort of like a bit of the opposite from the racism, we were able to motivate slightly more progressive attitudes among Republicans when we showed them the moderate treatment. So just sort of the flip side in some ways of what we found with respect to structural racism.
And we should say too that these solution-related things, they weren't just about the moderate proposal. They were just about all solutions in general. So we didn't ask like, right, hey, that proposal that we just told you, how do you feel about it? We said, kind of in general, how do you feel about these policies? So it was like an overall, just toward all solutions, basically what the measure sort of suggested.
Right. So, I mean, I will say that our findings were not a complete home run, right? We didn't get every result we wanted. We didn't find significant effects for extreme climate or moderate racism conditions. So some uneven pattern results, more suggestive than sort of a rock solid case, but at least interesting, I think, that suggests we need to explore these dynamics more in subsequent research. And we did find that there is this non-trivial share of participants who did believe in the problem more so than they supported the solution. So kind of like what those quotes that Ben was suggesting earlier about something like, I think it's like 1/6, about 1/6 of the subjects that we were working with did express belief in the problem of structural racism or climate change, but they were rather skeptical of the solution in general. And so you might say that 1/6 doesn't seem like a lot, but I would sort of argue differently. Like 1/6 of the population is not an electorally trivial amount of voters out there, and especially in a nation that is as closely divided as ours. So in fact, this is in some ways one of the most interesting findings from the paper, is that there really are people out there that are maybe turned off to some extent by arguing about by being accused of being a climate denier or a racism denier, just because they don't necessarily agree with the proposals that liberals or progressives are putting out there. We're about 40 minutes here, so I'm actually going to kind of leave it at that. I have all the slides for all our figures and our tables and all that sort of thing, but I don't want to belabor the point. Those were what our results suggested, what I just described, some modest effects that suggest that some of the mechanisms we described are actually taking place. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben here again to talk for just a couple minutes about some of our conclusions, and we'll talk a little more broadly about our findings, and then we'll wrap up and turn it over to Song-Hoon for questions.
Right, and I'll try to be brief so we can get it to the questions quickly. So if it's true that what we're seeing here, that extreme policies kind of are potentially a turnoff, and moderate ones might actually be useful for recruiting more support, why aren't these sort of moderate or incremental policies that would be less drastic than the other ones, why aren't they being advocated or talked about as much? Well, one reason is that these are drastic problems, and so if you see climate change as a threat to all humanity in the next 12 years or so, then maybe you might sort of want a drastic solution, and maybe an incremental, a moderate one wouldn't seem good enough. So it could be just like we need the big guns for this. But also there's kind of been this trend over time where, as polarization has spread the parties apart ideologically, it's made it harder to compromise across the parties to pass policies. And it's made those incremental policies, like minor changes or consensus building policies, less useful for rhetoric in elections or in government, when you're in power. Advocating for a big sweeping change is going to get folks more excited, and that might be a reason why you hear more about a Green New Deal than about a moderate, balanced economic and environmental sort of policy to deal with regulation kind of stuff. And if it's the case that we're in an era where you kind of have to be in control of the legislature and the White House to get some big policy done, then these small changes might seem like a waste of time and a waste of power. So once you get control, you know that once you lose it, you're not going to be able to cooperate with the other party. So it's time to use what you can right now. But of course, you have to actually get that single party control and then be able to leverage it to your advantages. Right now, we're in divided government, so that is kind of off the table while the House is controlled by Republicans for Democrats to move the ball any further on, say, climate change or structural racism issues, because they'd have to compromise, and those are not really easily compromisable things. So these are reasons why, even if an incremental policy might be more persuasive, it's not necessarily going to be advocated right now. Our big takeaways here: first of all, this is a group of people that are not deniers, but oppose the policy. So if you were thinking that everybody who's opposed to climate change policies or structural racism addressing policies is just denying the problem, our results suggest there's actually a pretty big chunk who say, yeah, I agree with you, that's a real thing. I just don't like your proposal for what this thing would be. And that's a different story than problem denial, and what we think is worth paying attention to and telling about. These drastic proposals, the ones that are more extreme, that are sort of more a departure from the status quo, might be less effective than incremental or moderate ones at trying to get people to support. And it might actually sort of dissuade people who already kind of agree that the problem is a real thing, but aren't really sold on those solutions there. With all the focuses on trying to prove to deniers this is a real problem, that might mean ignoring the people, the 1/6-ish that we found, who are probably more persuadable. If you're trying to bring somebody to your side on the issue of climate change or structural racism, the person who denies that it exists at all is probably less easy to convince than the person who kind of agrees with you that this problem is a real thing, but maybe needs to see more about the solution, needs that to be kind of proven to them as a viable option or a useful sort of thing to do. So if you're, our sort of our message or takeaway for, say, activists on these issues is, don't just proclaim the problem. Don't just sort of say it's real, it's a real thing, it's a big deal. You have to also kind of sell the solution, and the arguments you would need for that are probably different from the ones of just sort of proving that the problem exists. So that's kind of our takeaway from that. Yeah, but go ahead.
I would just add one other thing, and an extension I'm thinking of that's going on right now in our politics, and that's related to the debt ceiling and the problem of the national debt. And this is something that Ben and I would have thought about. We sort of loosely talked about the idea of doing a similar experiment down the future. Right now, again, the issue of the national debt in the United States is a sort of an abstract one. Like, none of us are really directly affected by how much debt the U.S. has at any given time. But now it's sort of the reverse in some ways of what we're seeing now. An extreme solution that's being presented by Republicans is the idea of actually, not extending the debt limit, allowing a default from the national debt, which would be a extreme policy response with some pretty serious ramifications. I mean, if you believe top economists about that, at least. So it would be interesting to do sort of a complementary study of this, where we said, what is the likelihood that a liberal who was presented with the idea of, asked about the seriousness of the national debt, but they were presented at first with the idea of this extreme policy solution, the default, how would that affect your belief in the underlying attitude? Would your aversion to that solution affect your beliefs about the underlying problem? So that's the kind of thing that could be extended in future research, and there are other examples that we could probably think of as we continue to explore these opinion dynamics in future work. So with that, we've got about 45 minutes. So Sang-Hoon, if you have a couple of questions, we can try to respond to those. And then if there are any questions, I know there's at least one chat message here. But if you do have questions from the audience, you want to drop those in the chat, please go ahead. Otherwise, Sang-Hoon, welcome any comments and feedback you might have.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing your work, and I think it's just really timely research that has a lot of policy implications for these related topics. And I really like the part where you distinguish the problem belief and policy belief, and we can see approach to voters in different ways based on those the different distributions of people. And also interesting experiment design. I have a couple questions on the general theory side, and also a couple on the empirics. So first, with the kind of this frame of distinguishing problem belief and policy belief, and I was just thinking about it in terms of 2x2 table. There will be problem believer, problem deniers, policy believers, and policy deniers. And I guess I can see that, among those problem believers, there can be skeptics who are not who don't believe in those policy solutions, and also true policy believers and advocates. They believe in the issue, they believe in the solution. And on the problem denier side, they just deny everything, so they disapprove of the solution. Then we have one empty cell left, and I was wondering if you just like didn't think about those cells where those people who don't believe in the problem, but they maybe think about the option of adopting some solutions out there with the policy. Just like thinking theoretically if that makes sense, or if you thought about those. And I think, but in your the crosstab, I think you have some numbers there. So like it would be helpful because you skipped that slide. Maybe it would be helpful if you just like tell us like how many, the proportion in each part. Yeah, here. So like what were the numbers in like in your data? And the second question was, so here, well, actually two questions. So first, the issues that you're looking at are more kind of liberal issues, as I see it. And these here, the conservatives are the deniers and the liberals are more advocates. So do you expect the same theoretical or empirical findings from if you chose some like more conservative issues, something like pro-life or pro-gun rights issues? Do you expect to see the same patterns in terms of people's response, in terms of persuading the voters? And relatedly, I was wondering if this kind of denier and belief is coming from ideology, so between conservatives and liberals, or from the partisanship, Democrats and Republicans. So, I mean, they kind of overlap, but it's not always the case. So if you have any, if you have thought of it, like it would be interesting to hear. And I guess just like one quick question about the empirics. I was wondering if there was any heterogeneous effect on the voter side. So, you were talking about the advocates, skeptics, and deniers. Were there different levels of treatment effect across those three groups, or did like Democrats or Republicans respond differently to the treatment and so on? So, but once again, thank you for sharing your research.
Yeah, thanks, Sang-Hoon. So let me see if I can knock out a couple of things from that, and then Ben, you can follow up if you have anything. With respect to your last question, Sang-Hoon, about the like heterogeneity of the treatment, I just don't think we have an answer for that right now. We have to look at the data again, unless Ben has something on that. I think it's a fair question, but I just don't think I just don't have that at my fingertips. Ben, do you have anything on that?
So we did have a little bit of heterogeneity of Democrats to Republicans, right? Where we saw that Republicans responded more to the moderate, sort of thing for climate than the Democrats did. That's partly just a ceiling effect because Democrats were already more, sort of like climate acknowledging, already, so they had less room to move. We don't really have the ability to look at differential effects of activists versus, people who are, deniers versus the ones who believe but don't like the solution, just because we measured all that afterwards. We only measured it once. So we didn't know you were, we only had that one measure. That's kind of also our dependent variable. So we would have to kind of know beforehand, like do a pretest and see if they change their mind. We didn't have that facility here, but for Democrats and Republicans, yes, there was a variety. Republicans generally had more room to move upwards on the climate scales than they moved more in response to the moderate policy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Ben. You're right. So we were able to look at to that effect. With respect to the ideology and partisanship distinction, that's also a good question, Sang-Hoon, as we do, which merits, I think, further investigation, because it is pretty clear in the U.S. that we are really operating in like something like, I don't know, depending on how you define it, like a 5-party system in some ways, and we have this sort of strange coalitional structure within the parties right now. And as you're like in the Republican primaries right now, you're starting to see some of that play out already, and we certainly saw it in the primaries in 2020 for the Democrats. So it's definitely worth worth looking at more closely, because you do think that this is an area where there probably are some folks who you could maybe peel off and create some bipartisan consensus on some of these issues, and doesn't necessarily line up 100% like ideology and party. It's a little squishy on this. So that's definitely something that merits more work. With respect to the your question about like the conservative issues and like whether or not if we used abortion or gun control, or like I mentioned, the debt ceiling issue earlier, my suspicion is that we probably would see a similar dynamic. So you might be able to find, like, you might be able to manipulate how much progressives believe in the underlying problems associated with like, well, again, problems in quotation marks, right? But the underlying problem of like abortion rights, or like, should it be totally, completely without restrictions or whatever, you might be able to modify those attitudes a little bit based on the solutions that were being presented to respondents, and also with the debt ceiling, as I mentioned earlier. So that is a good extension, and one I think we could do pretty easily, frankly, like just design a slightly different survey, and we could roll it out. We should just do that. And then your very first question, if I remember correctly, it is interesting when you look at these crosstabs. These people in the upper left corner are pretty weird. I mean, there's like 10% or so of people, 8 or 10% of people who seem to believe in the solution, but they don't believe in the problem at all. That is, maybe they have like other reasons for wanting these outcomes. Like maybe they just like enjoy riding their bikes and they don't really care about like the climate change aspect of it. They just like riding their bikes. That is a conceivable mechanism, or maybe they just like the idea of, I don't know. It's a strange group, and I don't have a perfect answer. Ben, do you have anything that you want to like elaborate on with respect to the distribution of these numbers across cells?
Yeah, so the folks in the upper left quadrants here are the hardest to explain. Two possible interpretations would be one, that I don't think it's a problem, but I think we should be doing things to prevent it from becoming a problem yet. So maybe I don't think that climate change is really that bad now, but I think we should be, doing these things that are going to help prevent it from happening. If it does happen in the future, I might still want to do it as like a protection against a possible problem. And then the other possibility is that maybe if you're in that upper left quadrant on either of these grids here, you're somebody who supports a solution for reasons that are kind of like secondary, not the primary aspect of it. So, if I'm an African American who doesn't think that there's a big inequality issue or systemic racism issue, but I know that reparations would mean that I get some benefit, like I might, prefer that policy, even if I didn't think that I was suffering from some structural racism. Or if I'm somebody who, is working in green tech, or perceives some benefit to me for expansion of solar or wind or whatever, I might support climate change policies that would transition away from carbon because of that. And it wouldn't be about the problem itself, more so like some other benefit that wasn't the main thing. So you can tell stories about these groups and think of some ideas, but it would, take some, you have to ask them to find out what they really believe. And I would add one thing on the question of conservative and liberal issues. Border security is a good example of one where you could sort of pitch like an extreme versus a moderate solution, and you might have sort of denial of there even being a problem, that an insecure border isn't that insecure or is not that big of a deal kind of thing. So yeah, there's ways you could look at it on that side too.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, Ben. One thing you were talking about, these folks that may stand to benefit from sort of the ancillary effects of these policies, and that might be a reason they believe in the solution. I was thinking, so Ben and I are both graduates at the University of Nebraska, and I read a story. I think it was in Washington Post and New York Times. It might have been back in the local papers in Omaha, but in Nebraska, there is some ongoing debate because some of the ranchers out west in Nebraska are sitting on large deposits of rare earth metals, which are very beneficial for battery construction. So even though they are not particularly keen on giving up their internal combustion engine Ford F-150s, they are open to the possibility of making their lands available for mineral extraction for all these, latte sipping liberals, electric vehicles and the batteries that could be constructed out of what's underneath their farmland. So there are people out there that could stand to benefit sort of secondary order effects of these things. And maybe that's another target for persuasion that is, I think underutilized by progressive advocates that are out there. So it's an interesting, dynamic that we're touching on. So we just had really kind of one comment, one question from Joey in our audience, and Joey was saying that it seems that people's acknowledgement of the problem might be determined by how palatable the solution is to them, rather than the other way around. And was there any change? He asks, was there any change in Democrat liberal agreement with the problems after being shown extreme versus moderate solutions? And so the issue with looking at the Democrats and liberals with this is that their attitudes are like so high towards like believing in the underlying problem. There wasn't a lot of motion. If anything, you're kind of finding it more on the side of Republicans who might have somewhat more movable attitudes towards some of these things. I don't know, Ben, do you want to expand on that, or there are some ceiling effects involved, or what are other responses to that?
Yeah, not just that they might be more movable in general, but maybe that, think about all of our treatments were statements saying, yes, we should have a policy, right? They were all, if they were going to be effective as designed, they'd be moving you up on that scale. If we had been trying to say, poo-poo the idea of the Green New Deal or reparations, maybe Democrats would have been more reactive to it than Republicans, because they had further to fall on the scale, basically. So I don't believe in any of ours we found much of a distinction or difference between the extreme or liberal or moderate policies on Democrats' attitudes or liberals when we broke it down that way, because again, they're not exactly the same thing. I think because they were kind of, most Democrats, at least in our sample, were pretty well bought into these ideas, these policies being, these issues being real, and the policies, they were kind of down with them already. So they didn't have much further to go up, and they weren't going to be sort of dissuaded that much by an extreme policy position.
Okay, well, I appreciate those of you who watched this. Thank you again, Sang-Hoon, for offering your suggestions and feedback. We really appreciate that. Thank you, Ben, for offering your expertise and your time to us here at Johns Hopkins University. We got just a couple more thank yous in the chat. So, all right. Well, thanks all again for joining. This conversation will be posted through our social media outlets for the data analytics and policy program and advanced academic programs. So with that, I will just say thanks again, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your evening. Thanks. Bye.